welcome everyone to this week's Rough Cut. So be sure to check on the IOE website for the complete schedule for the whole semester. And are we recruiting yet for fall Rough Cuts, or?
Yes, we are, but we're also talking with, I had a good conversation with a bunch of graduate students on campus about possibly changing some of the structure of our Rough Cuts as well.
All right, so stay tuned for exciting new developments. Today we're very excited to have Neva Hassanein she's a professor of environmental studies at University of Montana. She got her PhD in land resources at University of Wisconsin and a master's in environmental studies at University of Oregon. She does research, teaching, and civic engagement, largely focused around food and agriculture, but she also gets involved in land use planning, gender issues, environmental policy. Her work is inherently multidisciplinary, I think I can say, but it incorporates aspects of sociology and political science and gender studies. And in addition to her research and teaching, she's also engaged in working with nonprofits. So that's enough for me. I'll turn it over to Neva.
Thanks a lot, Rich. Thank you all for coming out today. I am happy to be here, and I want to thank Anna Tuttle for helping to arrange this talk and my visit here to share some ideas with you. And Anna had mentioned to me that the notion of a rough cut talk is to give you some ideas that may be still in formation. So I'm going to do that, and we'll welcome your help in elaborating on them when we get a chance to visit at the end. So I'm a social scientist with interdisciplinary training. All my degrees are in environmental studies, but I'm very much interested in the theory and practice of social movements. And I want to talk with you today about the ways that people, who we might call food citizens, are engaged and working together, both here and around the world, to try to transform their food systems, to make them healthier, more sustainable and resilient, more democratic and just. And in many ways, the subject of food in our society today is contested terrain. Welcome, come on in. And yet, even though it's contested terrain, of course, food brings people together, right? Whether around a table or, in this case, through collaborative action in communities. In fact, if you follow contemporary food issues at all, you're probably already aware that there are a wide variety of organizations and individuals that are working on food systems change. It's kind of a hot topic, even. And what we see, I mean, somebody like myself that is really interested in, is the ways that citizens within civil society, right, are innovating, right, are engaging in civic innovation, and they're also actively participating in ways that are much more than simply, for instance, voting, right, as a citizen might do. And so this constellation of activities that takes place in a variety of ways and at a variety of scales is often referred to today as the food movement, right, which is a big amorphous term. But one aspect of that larger social movement, and that I'm going to focus primarily on today, is the efforts that are around relocalizing food systems, right? Bringing food systems back to the local level to at least some extent. Local food, as you're probably very well aware, has been a hotbed of innovation and participation, in fact, excitement. Like other social movements, the food movement has a variety of, historical roots, different strains of activism and orientations within it. But I think it's fair to say that those who associate with this movement have a shared belief in that our conventional sort of dominant agricultural system is problematic in certain ways. And in particular, there is a notion that there are alternatives to that dominant system. There's not just one way in which we can organize to produce and distribute food. So scholars like myself who are interested in social movements study them to understand things like how and why people organize and mobilize other people, what forms that collective action takes, how people develop a sense of collective identity or a sense of belonging to a social movement. We also are interested in what the political, social, and cultural consequences are of movement activities. Now, activists and practitioners are also interested in reflecting, or the good ones are, in reflecting on movement activities to try to identify strategies that work well, for instance, or what doesn't work well, ways to increase participation in these kinds of initiatives, and how to maximize the chances for success. So one of the aspects of what I want to call today civic food networks, I'll explain that a little more in a minute, but one of the aspects of these movements I have found is that the issues are not only about food, they're also very much about democracy. Now, if you're looking at, whether you're looking at issues around genetic engineering, farmland loss, hunger and food insecurity, all these things actually have cross-cutting through them. If you look at it from a sociological perspective, you see basic questions about democracy emerging in that context. Let's see, so this one? Yeah. There's a lot of buttons up here. Great. Where's the, sorry about that. Oh, okay. Today I want to talk a little bit more about this idea of food democracy and to draw on an example and draw on some examples of activities that are happening here in Montana, and in particular, the Governor's Local Food and Agriculture Summit, which was held here across the way in October. And I want to use that to try to illustrate how these concepts around food democracy and civic food networks can help us understand the processes of cooperation and meaningful participation that are really clearly evident in this work today. So before I go on, I have this compass up here to remind me to say just briefly my own positionality, my own role in this, is that I've been studying food democracy as a scholar for many years and wrote some papers that I think have had a little bit of impact on that topic and how it's discussed in the field of agri-food studies. But I've also been very much part and parcel of and involved in the food movement here in Montana. So I bring that long-term experience and observation, almost 17 years now, of my work here in Montana. So I'm grounding this in both my experience and in data that I want to share with you today. Before I go on, though, I want to be sure that when I use the word food system, folks have a sense of what I am talking about. For a long time, many of us in academia focused primarily on production ends of things, but increasingly there is an emphasis on the entire food system, right? Human resources, off-farm and on-farm inputs, food production, food transformation, processing, manufacturing, marketing and labeling, distribution, food acquisition, how do we get food, retail, direct markets, those kinds of things, and consumption and choice, right? And where the average person in the marketplace, how do they make decisions? There are a lot of questions that are circling around what this food system is like today. And I'm going to use the term a lot, and really when I do, what I'm thinking about primarily are this whole set of interconnections that really literally bring us food from the soil, right, to our plates. This quick slide I want to share with you is done by some friends at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and I like it because it helps us think about what they call the tiers of the food system. Food systems operate on multiple scales. And so at ground zero, here's my backyard garden and maybe yours. Maybe you hunt or fish, gather food for yourself. Maybe you gather mushrooms. And if you do, I want to talk to you about your favorite patches afterwards. I like to hunt mushrooms. Anyway, there's also, as you're probably aware, an increased role for direct markets. Even here in Montana, we see the number of farmers and the dollar value of sales to direct markets increasing considerably over the last 20 years. You can then think about a slightly higher tier, which are strategic partners in the supply chain. This might be something like the Western Montana Growers Cooperative, which aggregates the produce of about 35 grower members in Western Montana, and then distributes that produce all the way here to Bozeman and out to Billings even. And they are able to do that through a series of supply chain relationships that are based less on competition and more on cooperation. And then beyond that is the systems that we're all pretty familiar with, right? Large volume aggregation, Cisco. If you're ever in Billings, go check out the Cisco warehouse, the heart of the dominant food system, right? It's a fascinating place. Take some students, go check it out. Right? Beyond that, there's the global grain traders and others who move food around the globe, don't produce any food, but play a huge role in that distribution process and aggregation. It's also characterized by lack of transparency, if you will. So when I use the term food democracy, I'm coming at it because I constantly ask these questions about who controls food in our society and how do they do that, and who should control food. So the idea behind food democracy is that people ought to have at least an opportunity to meaningfully participate in the food systems that affect their lives, right? Can we all play a role in shaping our food systems? And food democracy, harkens to the notion that really founded the United States, right? With the idea that citizens actually can contribute meaningfully to public solutions to public problems. I have carried out a number of empirical studies on food democracy. I've written a thought piece on it as well. And I am thinking about how to apply it to this event that Mary Stein was the MC at last fall, the Governor's Local Food and Agriculture Summit, and that's what I want to share with you today. As I've studied these topics, I've really come to understand that these struggles, and they are struggles over who controls the food system, are really important to unpack and to look at and to think about who's making the decisions about something as important as food, right, that we literally put into our bodies. What could be more intimate than that? So by food democracy, I mean the notion that people can and should have the power to meaningfully participate in shaping their food systems. Scholars have identified and described a shift that's occurring, for instance, among consumers who see themselves, some consumers who increasingly see themselves less as consumers of goods, but more as food citizens, right? Oftentimes in our contemporary democracy in this country, right, we as consumers are led to believe that the way we act is by what we buy. Right? And certainly the local food movement has tapped into that with slogans like buy fresh, buy local, right? It's about what we buy. But are we only consumers? Do we have an opportunity in dialogue and constructive problem solving with our neighbors, which is, and to really become more like food citizens rather than only food consumers? Similar kind of shift is happening among farmers who are going from a perspective of selling their products into very distant markets that are anonymous, that they don't necessarily have a connection to. We see a greater number of farmers and ranchers interested in locating their production in a broader social and political context.
Ghost.
Well, this is a photo from Timeless Seeds farm walk last summer. But I really am just using it to give you a little something to look at while I explain a couple of concepts to you. And this is this analytical framework that I've been working on and developing. And I wrote a couple of pieces a while ago now that try to develop this notion of food democracy and food citizenship that I just mentioned. Some others have built on this idea by developing the notion of what's called a civic food network. And here the idea is that there are a collection of linked actors, right, within a network. And if you're at all familiar with or been involved in this activity, you're aware that there are networks out there that are very distinct. And it might even saying that, somebody like Mary is going, well, big deal, Neva. And of course there's a network. It's very obvious when you start to get into it that there are a whole host of actors across Montana and elsewhere that are linked together. And they have this web of relationships. And part of my job as a social scientist is to understand those relationships, understand how the patterns of these relationships and what the form they take on. And they take on this, they change over time, but they, in a variety of ways, these networks are what is making possible a lot of the activity we see here in a place like Montana around local food. I think these networks are important because they point to ways that we see changes in the governance of food systems. And, you know, by governance here, I'm referring to the decisions that get made about what our food system looks like. And what we see is citizens taking some of this into their own hands. And it was never more clear than it was last fall here at the Governor's Summit. The idea of civic engagement or civic culture, right, is grounded and rooted in particular places. Right? So when we engage in civic activity, it's in a particular place. It has a particular context. And I'm increasingly realizing in my study of local food movements that this inhabitation, this dwelling in a particular place is really important to flesh out more. Too often, if you're familiar with any of the literature that looks at the kinds of initiatives that are coming out of the food movement, right, like community-supported agriculture, or farmers markets, right? There's a lot of studies of those particular kinds of initiatives. And I've begun to wonder, well, is the initiative, right, is a farmer's market really telling us the full story? Do we need to understand this civic activity in the context of a particular place? And as you'll see, I'm interested in talking about that with the context of Montana. Let me see here. So first, I'm going to briefly introduce the summit. This is Governor Schweitzer. Governor Bullock. This was a few days before the election, and we were all wondering, was he going to continue to be our governor? And he is. This summit was held last fall, as I said. It was the second summit in the state. The first one was called by Governor Schweitzer. It was held in Great Falls. Many of the people who were at that earlier summit came to this one as well. So there was a lot of dialogue going on about what changes have occurred since the earlier event. There were 209 people who came, and I'm going to show you some statistics, or some data that we collected at the event a little bit later, tell you a little bit about who was there. But I was excited to get to participate in this event, and 8 of my graduate students who were in a class on the politics of food with me last fall chose as their project to come and participate in the summit and try to record what was happening and do it in different ways. So there was a video made that I'm going to show in just a minute by 2 young men who are in our environmental journalism program. Then there were 5 tracks, which I'll explain in a minute, but these were sessions that ran through out the 2 days, and people were divided up based on topics that everybody stayed pretty much with the track that they chose. Each student has written up a report describing each of those tracks and what went on there. And in the process of editing and compiling, compiling all this into one document now, but it will be available through the National Center for Appropriate Technology. The last project was a survey, and I'm going to present those results to you in a bit. So I want to, in my remaining time, is to show you this video because it really gives you a sense of what I'm talking about. When I say civic engagement, participation, right? These are not flat ideas. These are a bunch of my students talking with Tracy Stone Manning, who's the governor's chief of staff, who is also an alum of our program. So I just wanted to give them a shout out. Their work is really what I'm presenting today. So if you are tuning in out there in remotely, I would invite you to go to this hyperlink, foodsummit.ncat.org, and scroll down to the first video and watch it because we're unable to stream it through the system here. And I will try to get it going here.
No, go ahead.
Okay. This is not moving forward.
Oh, go ahead and just click, use your mouse and click on the screen. Anywhere, fine, just click on it.
Okay, so a number of years ago, in thinking about this idea of food democracy, hi Allison. In fact, I wrote a paper on food democracy when Allison was the guest editor of the Journal of Hunger and Environmental Nutrition. And I looked at an example in Missoula and studied it from a wide variety of angles and came up with some dimensions of food democracy. In other words, I was asking, how would I know food democracy if I saw it? Right? Well, how would we know if we were moving into a direction where citizens, average people, have more control over their food systems compared to the dominant food system that is largely controlled by a small number of corporate actors, which I'm sure you're aware of. And in developing these dimensions and then thinking about them now more recently in preparation for this talk, I've been trying to look at, okay, were these on display at the Governor's Summit and in advance of the Governor's Summit? And I would argue, yes, they were very much so. Right? There were 12 different organizations that collaborated before the summit to put the whole thing on. And it included, not just the governor's office and the Department of Agriculture, but also the Office of Public Instruction, other government agencies. It included a number of nonprofit organizations in Montana. It also included a number of university and extension folks involved in the effort, and as well as a community development corporation. So even just by bringing these people together to organize this event, we saw collaboration that could not occur if one group on their own was trying to do this. I think that collaborative action increases our power, and it enables organizations to affect greater change by increasing the number of people who are engaged. So that's a pretty simple idea. Food democracy also very much depends, as I've said already, on meaningful participation, not just participation by what we buy, right? But where do we meaningfully engage? And I would say that the summit was an excellent example of food democracy in action. The facilitator of the summit overall, who designed it, Barbara Russmore from here in Bozeman, did a phenomenal job of getting people on the same page and thinking about how each of the sessions would be run. The facilitators of the various sessions were trained in advance, right? So there was a real deliberate and intentional spreading of the expertise in the room and the leadership in the many rooms that we took up, actually. The 5 tracks, there were 5 tracks, and I'm just going to throw this up here. These are the names of each of the tracks, just so you can see the kinds of topics that were being discussed. Now, these 5 tracks met I counted up last night, for a total of about 8 hours, okay? They ranged in size from probably 15 to 20 people to 40 people in each one. And people spent a long time, okay, building the knowledge that was necessary to make decisions, sharing knowledge freely and openly, and doing so in a way that eventually led to some specific outcomes and decisions, which were sets of action plans out of each of the tracks, okay? And I mention this because there's actually a sense in these movements that nobody's exactly the expert, right? Nobody has a blueprint for where we're going, what we're doing, okay? But that together, by becoming knowledgeable about the system, sharing our knowledge with each other, we can make better decisions. Engaging in talk, right, deliberating over topics is also really key to any democratic process, right? Although we don't always see it at the federal or state level, but when we think about democracy as a practice, really the idea of deliberation and talk is really central to democratic theory. And I should say that, I meant to mention this earlier, when I talk about food citizens, right, I'm not talking about the legal sort of status of citizenship, right? I mean more of the denizen sense, or the Greeks meant, right? The idea that the ancient Greeks that citizens do things, right? They actually engage in problem solving. So when I'm using that term, I'm not meaning it in the sense that our president means it. And so there's a sharing of knowledge. There were experts included in this event. You saw Fred Kirschman there. Also Michael Schumann, who's the economist who's written a lot about local food economies and local economies in general. They were there. It was interesting. They were there all weekend, right? They spoke, fairly briefly, relative to the whole thing. There was not a privileging of expertise, right? And I think that was really neat. And it was really, says a lot to me about both Fred and Michael, that they were willing to stay the whole weekend. They were right there in it with everyone in a way that I really found encouraging. We also had folks from the state government there, but again, it wasn't like everyone was looking to the state to solve problems, right? We were looking to each other, not that we wouldn't want the state to help, they do, and that's fantastic, but there's a real sharing of the knowledge and expertise, which I think was really valuable. The universities were well represented, and of course, we didn't take any expertise away from anybody. But I think this is really a couple of key points here. I want to, since it's going to take a little time to share with you the results of our survey, I want to just mention a couple of last things here with respect to efficacy. This was an idea that when I did a study of 10 years ago now, elaborating these dimensions, I didn't really anticipate this idea of efficacy coming into play, but it very much did, right? So it emerged from the work I did and from the data that I studied. And efficacy, right, of course, is the idea that in the sense that you can have an impact on the world, right? That you can make a difference. And so I think there are a couple of ways, at least, to give you an example, that this was evident. There was repeated conversation that talked about the last summit and what has happened since then. Okay, so there was a recognition that we have collectively had an impact. Right, so there's a sense that we can produce these desired results. Now, there was also a lot of worry, and probably rightly so, that the action plans that were generated out of these sessions, there was worry that they might not be implemented and sustained and moved forward beyond the event. But rather than see that as a problem, I see that as a positive thing in the sense that people really believed that these are ideas that are worth pushing, that they are worth achieving, right? There's a sense that we can have an impact and that we ought to. And also, I think you can see throughout, I'm still working on how to exactly illustrate this idea of the common good, right? Where we citizens, at least theoretically, we would transcend our personal interest to think also about the common good. And I think that comes out a little bit in some of the survey results that I'm going to share with you. But this is just to give you quickly a sense of how you might take this analytical framework and look at a particular event. So On my last 5 minutes here, I'm going to share with you some of the survey results. And big shout out to Jillian Thornton for her work on putting this together. There were 209 attendees total. We gave out the surveys in hard copy, also had a URL where people could go and do it online, but it was easy to just do it right there. 110 people responded, which is a decent response rate, not as high as I would have liked, but 53% is okay. And we don't really have any reason to believe that the people who didn't participate would answer differently than those who did. Maybe they would, but it's hard to know. You can't know. 77% of the respondents are women, which probably mirrors the makeup of the people in the room. It wasn't just that the women were willing to take the survey, I don't think. You see a lot of women engaged in this work. People range from 19 to 76, a whole range of ages were there, a range of people who've lived in Montana for different lengths of time. And they gave us their reasons for why they wanted to attend, right? So there, again, you see this idea of, I want to learn, I want to gain knowledge about the food system, I want to contribute in some way to it. I want to redo this and kind of look at what regions of Montana were represented, but basically 20 of Montana's 56 counties were represented by at least one person. You can see Gallatin, Missoula, top of the list, and of course Gallatin's right here, so that makes sense. But you also see a number of western Montana counties represented, folks coming over here to participate, as well as people coming from much farther afield. Okay. And even some from out of state. We asked people to identify their role in the food system. What you see is that there's a range of knowledge and interests in the room. Only one, let me say it this way, a person could fill this out, this part of the survey, and could check as many as apply to them. Right? Only one person checked only concerned consumer. So it wasn't, so there were a lot of people there who were there perhaps for professional or work interests or just engagement in these topics. Lots of nonprofit staff. Other is this big category of people that we didn't quite locate in a particular category. But I think it's important to show that, look, the value of bringing diverse voices together is got to be key to democracy. We asked people what their perception of the progress that had been made in Montana is with respect to the local food and agriculture system today. And I am pretty impressed that 48% of the respondents, I take it back. This is the wrong slide. Okay, 94% of the respondents recognize either substantial progress or some progress, which is pretty cool, right? The people are seeing that there's been change. And when asked to identify how they would describe Montana's local food and agriculture system today, 48% said it's either doing really well or thriving. So, of course, quite a few said it's doing just okay or struggling, but there's still a very strong sense that, hey, we're doing a little bit better, we're thriving to some extent. Respondents identified the strengths of our local food system, and this again harkens back to this idea of collaboration and relationships within the civic food network, right? Relationships are overwhelmingly, important and recognized as a strength for participants. A lot of sense of pride in Montana and our heritage and the resiliency. Some people use words like grit, to describe Montanans. So it really came through strongly. Our production capabilities, we have a lot of land here, and an ability, despite what you might think, but we do have an ability to produce a wide range of products here. There's also consumer support and some local food infrastructure that's been put into place. And okay, the challenges I'll not surprise you either, and I will go quickly here, but the infrastructure is constantly a challenge. We used to have a joke that you couldn't go to one of these meetings without somebody talking about the need for a truck. Okay. And environmental challenges, including climate change and loss of agricultural land around our cities, where it's also mentioned. Cultural aspects, behavior, consumers, interest was recognized as a challenge. The dominant food system and the way in which it restricts or constrains people's ability to innovate or to branch out into other types of farming and food system work. Economic viability, access to food, some policies, and new farmers. And we're a state that, like everywhere else, our farmers are getting older, and it's harder and harder to get into agriculture. It's also harder to get out of it as well. So the kind of last big point I want to make here is regarding efficacy, right, and engagement. And so we asked the participants how often they engage in civic activities or political or service activities. And you can see that, over 50% are participating, at least 2 times a month in civic activities. So this is a highly engaged set of people, right? And they also see themselves as fairly efficacious, right? They, 47 people thought they could have a big impact on improving the system here in Montana. Total, moderate and big is 86%. So people feeling like they can make a difference. Last slide on this. On the survey, we asked people to give us their vision for Montana food and agriculture in the future, and they could give us 3 words or phrases, and so we categorized those into these larger themes that these words are intended to describe. But there's a sense of vibrancy. I'm not sure what to make of that. Thriving, vibrancy, excitement, right there. You go to these meetings, and most people are not belly aching, right? They're in there figuring out how to make things thrive. And I think that comes through here. Sustainable, diverse, accessible, and so on. So people have a vision for Montana agriculture, and they have began to articulate it in that survey and at this meeting. So I took this picture on Valentine's Day because it's a question I like to ask my students. So what? You told us all this stuff in your paper, right? So what? Why should we care? Well, I think there's a few reasons, right? One is that I think it's valuable to understand how people within civil society see themselves as people who can go about solving problems, being engaged, feeling efficacious. And the Governor's Summit was a really clear display of this web of relationships that I was mentioning when I talked about civic food networks. And I think understanding the spaces within society where people are trying to solve problems and understand what's maybe constraining them and to break free of that, really gives us a sense of the way that social movements in particular can spawn new innovation, new ideas. We have a society that often looks to experts for solutions, looks to the government for solutions. But in fact, we also have a citizenry that is actively engaged in trying to find some of these solutions. And I think for me, it suggests that we see emerging within civil society some new forms of governance, right? New that really are not housed in any particular organization or individual, right? It's and there's not even really a clear bar of like who's in and who's out. Right? Anybody could come and participate, and I think that sort of ongoing inquiry and engagement with one another over time really will give us some tools that we can use, hopefully in the future, to be more resilient and sustainable in the long term. So thanks very much for your attention. I apologize for going over.
Right. We have some time for some questions.
Oh, I have to throw this one slide up there because this was on Facebook the other day. Right? Seeds of resistance, the grassroots mix. Right? Will grow under any conditions best when planted together. And what I just want to mention this because here you see food justice, food issues being embedded within a larger intersectional movement that's emerging more and more today. So I thought that was pretty fun, and this is a quote from Barry suggesting that food is intricately tied to our freedom as consumers. So one reason to eat responsibly is to live free. Questions, or comments, challenges?
What kind of, did Montana Food Bank Network participate in this? What do you say about that? Or UNESCO or anything like that? That's an aspect that you were saying within the state, but that is reaching out.
Yeah, we didn't, I don't think UNESCO was there, but a lot of, or not a lot, but certainly there were people who work with food banks and pantries around Montana who were participating. I don't know if you remember, I don't know if the network was there or not.
They may have been. I know that you saw the gentleman, Michael McCormick from the Livingston Food
Yeah.
Resource Center. He's definitely engaged in food security issues over in Livingston. So there were a fair amount of people working with food
Some
security.
folks in the Salish Kootenai tribes were in my group. I think we could have done better on involving more tribal members and on involving more people who are working on food insecurity. The first summit, food insecurity, was highlighted quite a bit, and partly it was because a lot of those folks were at the table in the planning process and really encouraging that to be folded in, and I think maybe that was a piece that fell off a little bit this time, unfortunately.
So some food issues we tend to think, well, as long if someone wants to buy locally grown potatoes versus potatoes that came in from a long way away, then we can handle that with labeling and making sure that there are marketing channels available so that that product's available, but we won't impose that on everybody, right? In other cases, we're much more, no, the whole system needs to change because, no one should be allowed to be buying produce that has pesticides residues there. Everyone should be, forced into the same marketing channel. How do you think about where is it appropriate to have multiple products, multiple marketing channels, and let people decide which pieces of this they want, and where is it, no, everyone should be kind of in the same boat?
Great question. So the market is incredibly powerful, obviously, right? And market-based strategies within the food sector have been very successful in many ways. So organics continues to grow at a rate of about 15% a year in total sales. Montana is now the #1 state for organic acreage. Just had to throw that in. But and that's actually really wonderful for our farmers who can't market as easily directly, right? They're much further from our urban centers. So the market-based strategy can be very effective, but if you think about, or I'm just going to take organic because it's more it's more prescribed in law. And organics has grown tremendously, and yet we still have a gap between that organic production and everything else, right? And organic producers essentially regulate themselves. If they say, I'm willing to be part of this system because I believe in it, or I think I'll make more money doing it, or whatever their reasoning is. And so you end up with this two-tiered system that is kind of problematic. So in focusing on developing the organic system, perhaps there has been less attention to what might be appropriate regulations for the dominant system, within us. So, for instance, on regulating it on pesticide use. So I think that gap is real, and there's also price considerations that come into play. I think the market is powerful and yet limited as a tool for change, because what markets are not designed to promote social equity or ecological integrity, right? They're designed to produce profits. And we can, by labeling, for instance, or certification, we can break out of that a little bit by unmasking those commodities, right? So that we're seeing a bit more of what the process was that went into it. But markets are not really intended to create social change. So I think it's a limited strategy in many ways. I don't know if that answers your question. Will you say more what you think you mean, or Mary?
I just had a thought that relates to that. An example of where there has been a significant change in a whole group of people is like in the school food program, antibiotic-free chicken is now the only chicken that's being fed across the board with the school meals federal program.
Wow.
They're buying antibiotic-free chicken, and it was kind of it was a lot of years in the making to have the health science really clear on impact of antibiotics in children. The economics of it needed to be so, because there's not a lot of money to spend on school food, and then the production, they had to get the production side right so that the volume was available of antibiotic-free chicken. So these things are all happening in balance with one another, but that's an example of where, across the board, they're now feeding children antibiotics.
I just wanted to make a note of that, and I don't remember the number, but there was a bill introduced in the House with regards to the Department of Education, and one of the things is to eliminate the health standards for school.
Right.
In the
Oh, yeah. It's a
schools.
very politicized
For school food.
thing. Yeah.
Yes, yes.
Right, I think the Secretary of Education has even been questioning whether we should have school food.
Right.
Anyways, it's just that we might be changing back to.
Oh,
Yeah.
something starved out.
Well, I want to be mindful of time and let you go, but I'm also happy to visit more if anybody has any comments or questions.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.